Okay, this video lecture is going to be on the second half of Chapter 11. Chapter 11 is all about prosocial behaviors or helping behaviors. So the first part of this lecture, we're going to be talking about research that looks at prosocial behaviors and individual differences. So prosocial behavior in personality, prosocial behavior in gender differences, prosocial behavior in cultural differences, prosocial behavior in religion, and prosocial behavior and the effects of mood. Okay, then we will continue on talking about situational effects of prosocial behavior, rural versus urban situations, what that means in terms of prosocial behavior. How about residential mobility, how that affects whether or not people help out. We'll look at a very interesting bit of research on bystander effects and prosocial behavior. We'll look at prosocial behavior and cyberspace, talking specifically about the diffusion of responsibility there, and looking last at prosocial behavior and media effects. All right, so that'll be it for this lecture. Okay, psychologists have long been interested in altruistic personality. That's the type of personality where the qualities that an individual has cause them to help others in a wide variety of situations. Social psychologists, however, have found that it's not just being able to define someone as an altruistic personality that predicts helping behaviors. It's not just personality alone, it's also the situation. The situation is important in predicting who's going to be helpful. So that's important to note here. But in terms of prosocial behaviors, we often look to defining this as people who have altruistic personalities, who help a lot. Okay, so let's talk about gender differences in prosocial behavior. So I want you to consider two scenarios. In one scenario, someone is involved in a long-term helping relationship, like assisting their disabled neighbor with chores around the house. Second scenario, someone performs a dramatic, heroic act, like storming the cockpit of United Flight 93 to fight the terrorists. Okay, so are women or men more likely to help in each of these scenarios or situations? Think about that for a second. Well, if you guessed that women were more likely to help in the first scenario and men were more likely to help in the second scenario, you're correct. Women are more likely to be helpful in long-term relationships that involve greater commitment, whereas men are more likely to be helpful when they are performing a heroic, chivalrous act, right? So in virtually all cultures, there are different behaviors that are prescribed for men and for women, and that we learn as we're growing up. So in Western cultures, men are expected to be chivalrous and heroic, where women are expected to be nurturing and caring and to value close long-term relationships. Okay, so we know that that it's going to be different in terms of prosocial behaviors for men and for women due to these gender stereotypes that are cultural. We also know that people in all cultures are more likely to help anyone that they define as a member of their in-group, more so than they're willing to help. They're not as willing to help those that they perceive as members of out-groups. So just remind us, what do we mean by in-groups and out-groups? As you recall, the in-group is the group in which an individual identifies with as a member. The out-group is any group with which the individual does not identify, right? So if it's a member of our in-group, then we're going to have more of a sense of connectedness to them, and we might be more likely to help them when we think that they're in need. Okay? If we think in terms of helping in-group members and out-group members, but we think in terms of Batson's empathy altruism theory, remember that Pope posits there's two routes to helping others. When we feel empathy, we help regardless of whether there's something in it for us. But when we don't feel empathy, we help only if there's something in it for us. Well, it turns out that people often do help both in-group and out-group members, but for different reasons along the lines of this theory. So we're more likely to feel empathy toward members of our in-groups who are in need. So we will help them because we feel empathy. We also tend to help out-group members, to put it bluntly, when there is something in it for us, such as making us feel good about ourselves or making a good impression on others. So again, helping in-groups and out-groups falls along the lines of Batson's empathy altruism theory, where the members of our in-group we are more likely to feel empathy for, whereas the members of our out-group we will help them if there's something in it for us. Also, this falls under different cultural differences in prosocial behavior, specifically in a lot of Latin American countries. There is a cultural value that we call simpatia, and this has no direct English translation, but it's basically it's where value is placed on helping other people and being very helpful and friendly and pleasant and good-natured. So this does lead people to have more prosocial behaviors when there's this strong cultural value. So no surprise here when we think about religion and prosocial or helping behaviors, what do we find? Well, generally speaking, the research has found that religious people are more likely to help other people who share their religious beliefs. The interesting thing is that religious people are no more likely to be helpful than non-religious people when it comes to helping strangers, for instance, like donating blood or tipping, okay? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the effect of mood on prosocial behavior. So there was a classic study done by Eisen and Levin, but way back in 1972, that showed this classic effect, which is called the feel-good, do-good effect. And this was a study that they did in a mall, where they went into a mall and they manipulated people's mood and then saw how helpful they were in terms of helping a man who dropped a file full of papers on the floor. And they manipulated mood by planting a dime in the payphone because this is way back before there were cell phones, right? And so you could use the dime to make a call from a payphone. So they actually put a dime in the payphone, and they watched people that went into the payphone, and then the people that would come out who would find the dime in the payphone. That was the manipulation to make those people feel good. And then whether the person found a dime or not, when they came out, a man would step in front of them. And he would drop a file of papers, and then they would see whether or not the person coming out of the phone booth stopped to help the guy with his papers. So they found this really crazy large effect that 84% of the people who found the coins in the payphone helped the man pick up his papers. Only 4% of those who didn't find the dime helped. So this was one of many studies that has shown when people are in a good mood, they are more helpful in a variety of ways. Okay, so there's been lots of replications of this, and we've seen that when people have done well on a test or received a gift, or when they have been prompted to think happy thoughts, or they've been listening to pleasant music, they're more likely to be helpful in many ways. Studies have shown, like contribute monies to charity, help someone find a lost contact lens, tutoring another student, donating blood, and helping coworkers on the job. So those are all ways that research has shown people would be willing to help other people out when they were in a good mood. So, being in a good mood can increase prosocial behavior. There's a lot of theories about why this is. Personally, I think it goes back to cognitive dissonance, and oftentimes when somebody has done something nice for you, then you feel like you need to do something in return. Or maybe you've done something recently that made you feel bad about yourself, so you have to find ways to assuage those bad feelings about yourself. And so if you do something good for someone, that restores your good opinion of yourself. More specific to this research, though, people have suggested that when you're in a good mood, you tend to look more on the bright side of life. So maybe you're more empathetic when you're in a good mood, and you see the person who's dropped his files on the floor. You tend to to think how much that would annoy you if you dropped your file, so you want to help him out. And this does play into, the theory is that when you're in a good mood, you're paying more attention to yourself. You're increasing your self-attention. Because you feel good, so you're noticing that about yourself. You're therefore more likely to behave according to your values, like helping behaviors. If you highly value helping behavior, which we're encouraged to in most societies, we're encouraged to. So again, that goes back to the good mood driving the empathy, which then drives the helping behavior. So that's sort of the theory behind a lot of the effects of good mood, feel good, do good effects. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, and this may go back to my theory of cognitive dissonance, some research has shown that a type of bad mood can lead to increased helping, which is when you're in a bad mood because you feel guilty about something. So that can lead to an increase in helping because people often feel that good deeds cancel out bad deeds. So again, this is restoring your good opinion of yourself. It's resolving cognitive dissonance because you feel bad about yourself. So in order to feel better about yourself, you do a good deed. And this doesn't have to, you don't have to actually do a good deed for the person that you've somehow injured. You just have to do a good deed for someone, right? So like if you had just forgotten that you realized that you'd forgotten your best friend's birthday and you felt guilty about that, you'd be more likely to help the person in the mall to repair your guilty feelings. So that does definitely suggest that somehow you're experiencing some sort of cognitive dissonance, and that helping someone else helps you resolve that cognitive dissonance and restores your good opinion of yourself. Okay? Now, as social psychologists, obviously we know that there is differences in helping behavior in different situations. And sure enough, one of the first places that we see a difference, if you look at the research, there's a clear difference between people who live in rural areas versus people who live in urban areas. So let's talk about an example of this, and I'm not going to clue you in as to who is more helpful, but let me give you an example. Suppose you're walking down the street one day when you see a man suddenly fall down and cry out with pain. He rolls up his pants leg. There's a bandaged shin he has that is bleeding heavily. What would you do? Well, it depends on where you are. If you're in a small town, research has shown that half of the people will walk by, like you might walk by, or half the people will stop and offer to help. Okay, but in large cities, 85% of people will walk by. Only 15% of passerby will stop to help. So why is it that people in big cities are less likely to stop and help passerbys, whereas out in the country, people are more likely to be helpful? Well, one theory, and I think we may have talked about this in this class already, is that people are less helpful in big cities, not because of a difference in their values, but because the stress of the urban life causes them to not stop and not help, right? And we would see this as perhaps people who grew up in small towns. Some people would say perhaps people who grew up in small towns are more likely to internalize altruistic values. But if we're social psychologists, we might say, well, we think the immediate surroundings might be the key and not people's internalized values, right? So this is called what? This is the urban overload hypothesis. If you put urban dwellers into a calmer, less stimulating environment, they would be as likely as anyone else to reach out and help others, right? And research does support this urban overload hypothesis. So when an opportunity for helping arises, it's more important where the incident is occurring as opposed to where the people who see it grew up, right? Again, this has to do with the theories, this has to do with urban overload. So even altruistic people may hesitate to stop and help, okay? So that's the overload hypothesis, the urban overload hypothesis. So what about residential mobility and its effect on prosocial behaviors? Well, what the heck do we mean by that? Well, it's not only where you live, urban or rural, but it might be also how often you have moved from one place to another. People who have lived for a long time in one place are more likely to engage in prosocial behaviors that help their community. So research has shown this. In many areas of the world, it's common for people to move far away from where they were raised. For example, in the year 2000, nearly 1 in 5 Americans were living in a different state than they were where they were just 5 years earlier in 1995. In big urban areas, fewer than half of the residents were living in the same house as they were in 5 years earlier. So it may be that because people in big cities are not long-term residents, a lot of them, maybe that changes the dynamic for them, and they are not as likely to be helpful. They're not as invested in their communities because living in one place does what? Living for a long time in one place gives you what? You're more attached to your community, you're more networked with your neighbors, you have a greater concern with how you appear in the community because everybody knows who you are, most likely, right? So residential mobility definitely has been shown with research to make a difference, okay? All right, so let's talk about a really interesting effect in terms of situational effects on prosocial behaviors. Let's talk about the bystander effect. So the bystander effect was first investigated by Latane and Darley in 1970. And this was all because they were social psychologists living in New York, and there was a very famous occurrence. There was a woman who was murdered. Her name was Kitty Genovese, and she actually was stabbed going into her apartment building late in the evening after she had come home from work. She was attacked by a stranger who stabbed her, and she started screaming, and people opened their windows, and there was like 38 witnesses, but there was a claim that supposedly nobody called the police because it took like 45 minutes for anyone to come help her. So no one could understand why there was all these people after it occurred. I mean, it took, like, this guy came back like 3 times before he finally killed her, and she was screaming each time, but no one helped her. So these social psychologists, Latane and Darley, started investigating this, and it was known as the bystander effect. They wanted to know why no one helped her. So what they found was that as the number of witnesses increased, the likelihood of anybody helping decreased. So the likelihood of bystander intervention decreased. So this graph is very interesting. This is research that they did where they had people fake like they were having an epileptic seizure, and they wanted to see how long it would take for people who were listening to it to react and do something about it. And so you'll see here the number of seconds that it takes for people to get help for the person that they're hearing supposedly having an epileptic seizure. The number of seconds it takes increases depending on the number of bystanders that are present. So when people thought they were the only bystander, they responded within just a little over a minute. But when people, like the red line, people who believe there was another bystander besides themselves, it took them longer to respond. And then again, the blue line, the participants who believe there were 4 other bystanders besides themselves, it took them the longest time to respond. So when people think that they're the only one witnessing somebody that needs help, somebody doing something, or somebody experiencing something that they need help, most of them will help very quickly. But when they think there are 2 people that know about this, they're less likely to help and do so more slowly. And when they believe that 4 people are listening, they're even less likely to help. So Bibb and Latane Latane and Darley came up with what they call the bystander intervention decision tree. And they basically claim that there's 5 points along this decision-making process that govern how people react to an emergency. Basically how their prosocial behavior is affected by the situation. So what's the first thing that happens? Well, the first thing that is that people have to notice, first of all. So noticing an event is the first step in the bystander intervention decision tree. So Darley and Batson in 1973 demonstrated that something as trivial as being in a hurry can make a difference because people may not notice an event. So this was research where they showed that seminary students who thought they were late, they were no more likely to help than those who were the least religious, right? So if you were distracted by being late, you were just as likely not to stop and help, okay? So then the next decision point on the tree is interpreting the event as an emergency, okay? So even if you notice the event, if you don't interpret the event as an emergency, again, you won't help. So you have to interpret the event as an emergency. Because if people think nothing is wrong, then they don't help. Okay. So when other bystanders are present, people are more likely to assume that it's not an emergency. Okay. So, for instance, in research, we've seen people will ask, is the person in the doorway drunk or seriously ill? Or is the white smoke coming out of the vent, is it something innocuous, like the mist from an air conditioner, or is it a sign that the building is on fire? So they're looking at the other people to see whether or not it's an emergency, right? Okay, and so the next point on the decision tree is called pluralistic ignorance. So if no one else is looking concerned, then the bystanders assume that nothing is wrong, okay? If other people look up, shrug, and go about their business, then we are likely to assume that nothing is wrong, which is what the research shows. If the other people look panic-stricken and yell fire, we immediately assume the building is indeed on fire, and we'll get people to do something, right? The danger is that sometimes no one is sure what's happening. And so because emergencies are often sudden and confusing events, people tend to freeze, watching and listening with blank expressions as they try and figure out what's going on. They glance at each other and they try and figure out why, what other people think about whether it's an emergency or not. There's this pluralistic ignorance, right? So here's the ambiguity. Here's a picture that shows the ambiguity, right? So this guy is sitting on the ground. He's holding his elbow. Is this an emergency or is it not, right? It's hard to tell. Does this man need help? Have bystanders failed to notice him, or has the behavior of other people led them to interpret the situation as a non-emergency? An example of pluralistic ignorance. Okay, so it's a very important question, right? So, continuing on with the bystander intervention decision tree, even if you interpret the event as an emergency, so even if you get past that pluralistic ignorance, then you have to assume responsibility, right? Assuming responsibility, we have to decide that it's our responsibility to do something about it, okay? This often results in this diffusion of responsibility, right? Where each bystander feels that maybe someone else is going to help. So there's this phenomenon of diffusion of responsibility, right? And again, this goes back to people looking to other people to see how, what they should do, this diffusion of responsibility. Again, going back to the bystander intervention decision tree, okay? Then if you assume responsibility, then there's this hurdle of knowing the appropriate form of assistance. So knowing how to help. So supposing it's a hot summer day, you see a woman collapse on the street. No one seems to be helping, so you decide it's up to you. But what should you do? Has the woman had a heart attack? Is she suffering from heat stroke? Should you call an ambulance, administer CPR, or try to get her out of the sun, right? Obviously, if people don't know what form of assistance to give, obviously they're going to be unable to help. So again, we have this hurdle where people have to get over. They have to figure out how to help. So if they do figure this out, then they are able to implement the decision and then offer assistance, right? So deciding to implement the help, there's some qualifications there. You may decide that you're not qualified to deliver the right kind of help. You might be afraid of making a fool of yourself, doing the wrong thing, placing yourself in danger, right? So, people see stuff on the news. There was 3 television network technicians who in 1982 saw a man beating a woman in a New York parking lot. They tried to intervene to help her, and they were shot and killed by the guy. So even when we know what kind of intervention is needed, sometimes we stop and weigh the costs of trying to help. So, and actually, simply imagining ourselves in a group is enough to make us feel less responsible for helping people. Okay, so this is a very interesting line of research, bystander effect. So, also a good thing to know for a test. So, social psychologists have also investigated how prosocial video games and songs, meaning that they're about helping behaviors, like Lemmings, which is a video game, or like the Beatles song Help, or We Are the World, or there's another lot of good songs out there, like Michael Jackson's Heal the World. Or the Beatles' Help. All these different sources of media, pro-social suggestions of pro-social behaviors in the media. Do they actually increase helping? Yes, they actually do. Why? Well, they probably increase people's empathy towards someone in need, and they also increase accessibility of helping thoughts. So in studies where people listened, either played these pro-social video games or listened to these songs and then had an opportunity to help afterward, they were more likely to help. People helped pick up jars of pencils that got knocked over. Researchers staged an event where the experimenter's ex-boyfriend charged in the room and tried to force her to leave with him, and the participants tried to help her. So there was a lot of different ways that people showed pro-social behaviors after they had listened to pro-social music or played a pro-social video game like Lemmings, where you're taking care of small creatures. So in this video, you'll see this that basically in these three different scenarios, the people who had done the pro-social video game were more likely to help. So it's quite fascinating. So how can helping behavior be increased? Well, this bystander, for example, stopped and helped this kid who was hurt on his bike. He was hit by a car. So why did people help when several other bystanders who witnessed the same emergency didn't help? Well, maybe this person had learned about the barriers. Maybe he had learned about the bystander effect in a social psychology class. And actually, we do know that makes a difference. If you're aware of these things, then you're more likely to not fall victim to these effects, right?